It was a regular Wednesday afternoon in the middle of fall during last period. I was in history class, drowsily jotting down notes while our teacher, Ms. Chambers, lectured on the Revolutionary War. I was half listening, my mind already wandering to the weekend. A couple of my friends in the back row were passing notes and trying not to laugh. Suddenly, the loudspeaker crackled. We all looked up, a little annoyed, thinking it was another random announcement. But then Principal Hargrove's voice came through, tight and nervous. "Attention all students and staff. This is a lockdown. I repeat, this is not a drill. Teachers, secure your rooms immediately." The tension in the room was instant. I looked around and saw the fear flashing in my classmates' eyes. Ms. Chambers froze for a second, then rushed to the door, locking it and switching off the lights. She moved quickly, pulling the shades over the windows and motioning for us to get down. We all crouched on the floor, huddling together in the corner furthest from the door. For a few minutes, there was only silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and a few students were sniffling quietly. No one dared to speak. And then we heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside the classroom. Everyone looked at each other wide-eyed. The scratching grew louder, like someone was dragging something sharp along the walls of the hallway. It moved slowly, inching closer and closer to our door. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. We held our breath, staring at the door. Ms. Chambers was tense, watching the door like it might burst open at any moment. After a few seconds, we heard a low, garbled voice, barely audible through the thick walls. I know you're here." The voice was calm, almost whispering, but it sent chills down my spine. Ms. Chambers gestured for us to stay silent, but one of my classmates, Danielle, let out a tiny whimper. I could feel her shaking beside me, her fingers digging into my arm. The voice grew louder. "You can't hide forever," it said, and then we heard the doorknob jiggle. The door rattled, but thankfully, it was locked. Still, the person outside wasn't giving up. The doorknob kept twisting, harder and harder, until it sounded like the metal might snap. Ms. Chambers was visibly terrified, whispering for us to stay calm, but I could see her hand shaking as she reached for her phone. She quietly tapped out a message, her fingers trembling, probably trying to alert someone in the main office. The rattling finally stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. Then, we heard footsteps, slow and heavy, fading down the hall. I thought it was over, but just as we started to breathe a little easier, the footsteps came back. This time, closer, louder. And then came the sound of something scraping against the lockers. Metal against metal, a slow, deliberate drag. It was like the person was taunting us, making sure we knew he was still there. A few kids started crying softly, covering their mouths to muffle the sound. Ms. Chambers looked like she was about to break down herself, but she kept trying to reassure us, whispering that everything was going to be okay. Suddenly, we heard someone pounding on a door down the hall. "Open up!" the voice shouted, angry and desperate. He banged on the door again, over and over, the sound echoing through the silent hallways. Then a loud crash, like he'd thrown himself against the door. And just as quickly as it started, everything went quiet. We sat in silence, listening to the faint sounds of police sirens approaching in the distance. Finally, after what felt like hours, we heard the sound of footsteps approaching again, but this time they were calm and steady. There was a soft knock on our door, and we heard Principal Hargrove's voice. "Miss Chambers, it's safe now. The police are here." She unlocked the door, and we slowly emerged from our hiding spot. Outside, officers were stationed in the hallway, and there was yellow caution tape stretched across the far end of the corridor. They were questioning teachers and staff, trying to piece together what had happened. Apparently, a man had somehow snuck into the school and had been wandering the halls for almost an hour before the lockdown was called. No one knew how he got in or what he was looking for. Rumors spread quickly that he was an escaped convict, a disgruntled former student, or just someone looking to cause trouble. But no one could say for sure. Later, we found out that when the police searched the building, they'd found strange markings scratched into several of the lockers near our room. And at the very end of the hallway, carved into the wood of one of the doors, were the words, "I'll be back." To this day, we still don't know who he was, or why he came to our school. But every time I walk by that hall, I get the feeling that someone, or something, is watching, waiting, just out of sight. And whenever I hear a strange noise in an empty hallway, I can't help but wonder if he ever really left. Being the new kid in school sucks. You probably know how it goes. Walking into a cafeteria full of faces you don't recognize, trying to figure out where to sit without looking like a total loser. I've always been awkward with people, and making friends wasn't my strong suit. So, when this kid, Daniel, invited me to sit with him at lunch on my third day, I was relieved. He wasn't exactly normal, but hey, neither was I. He had this weird, sarcastic sense of humor, always making jokes that felt a little too dark, a little too twisted, but I just went with it. At least I wasn't eating alone anymore. Daniel wasn't popular, not by a long shot. He was more of a loner, which probably explained why he reached out to me in the first place. I didn't mind. We both kind of stayed under the radar, and after a while it became routine. Lunch together, sometimes we'd hang out after school. I wouldn't say we were friends exactly, but it was better than nothing. Still, something about him always felt off. It wasn't just the dark humor. Lots of kids joke around like that. It was the way he looked at people, like he was watching them through a one-way mirror. Like he was sizing them up for something. But I ignored it. I didn't have a lot of options. One day, after lunch, Daniel asked if I wanted to come over to his house after school. He said his parents wouldn't be home, which seemed like a bonus to me. Who likes hanging out with parents hovering around? His house was about a 15-minute walk from school, tucked away on the edge of town in this neighborhood I'd never really noticed before. The place looked old, run down in a way that gave me a weird feeling, but I pushed it aside. I figured maybe his family was just going through hard times or something. The front yard was overgrown, the paint on the house peeling, and a couple of windows were cracked. "Come on," he said, waving me toward the door like it was no big deal. Inside wasn't much better. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. The floors creaked with every step, and there were random piles of junk, boxes, old furniture, scattered everywhere. It wasn't dirty exactly, just cluttered, like they never threw anything away. I tried not to stare too much, didn't want to seem rude. We went up to his room, and for a while everything was normal. We played some video games, shot the breeze, and Daniel seemed, well, normal enough. Maybe a little quiet, but I figured that was just how he was. We both weren't exactly chatty types, so the silence didn't bother me. But then, about an hour in, things started to get weird. Out of nowhere, Daniel paused the game and just stared at the screen. I thought maybe he was zoning out or something, but after a few seconds, he turned to me with this dead serious look on his face. "You ever think about how easy it is to hurt someone?" he asked. I laughed, hoping it was just another one of his weird jokes. But he wasn't laughing. He wasn't even smiling. His eyes had this strange, intense look, like he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't know what to do, so I just shrugged it off, trying to play it cool. I guess. I mean, what are you talking about?" Instead of answering, he stood up and motioned for me to follow him. "Come on, I want to show you something." Something in my gut told me to just leave, to say I had homework or something and get the hell out of there. But for some stupid reason, I followed him. Maybe I didn't want to seem like a wuss. Maybe I was just too curious for my own good. He led me to the basement door. It was this old wooden thing with rusty hinges that creaked like in some horror movie when he opened it. The basement was dark, really dark, and I could smell something foul coming from down there. It was like mold, mixed with something else. Something metallic. "After you," Daniel said, holding the door open. I hesitated for a second, but then I stepped inside. The stairs creaked under my feet, and the deeper we went, the colder it got. My heart was pounding, but I tried to play it off, like I was fine. When we reached the bottom, Daniel flicked on a single dim light bulb that swung from the ceiling, casting creepy shadows on the walls. The basement was cluttered, even worse than the rest of the house. There were old tools, broken furniture, and stacks of newspapers that looked like they'd been sitting there for decades. But what really caught my attention was the smell. It was stronger down here. Sour and sharp, like something rotting. Daniel walked over to a rusty metal cabinet in the corner and started rummaging through it. I stood there, feeling like I should leave, but not sure how to without making things awkward. Then, he pulled out this big kitchen knife, the kind you see chefs use on TV to chop meat. It gleamed under the weak light, and for a second, I thought I was imagining things. He turned to me, holding the knife loosely in his hand, and smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was tight, forced, like he was trying to hold back a laugh. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, his voice calm. "Unless you make me." I felt my blood run cold. My legs wanted to move, to run up those stairs and get out of there. But I was frozen in place, like my brain couldn't process what was happening fast enough. Daniel stepped closer, still holding the knife, his eyes locked on mine. "Relax," he said, his voice soft now, almost whispering. "I'm just messing with you." But he wasn't. I could see it in his eyes. I tried to laugh, to play it cool, but it came out all wrong, shaky, nervous. "Yeah, man, you got me. Good one," I said, slowly edging toward the stairs, trying not to let him see how scared I really was. Daniel didn't move at first, just stood there with the knife hanging at his side, watching me. Then, just as I thought I was in the clear, he stepped in front of the stairs, blocking my way. "What's the rush?" he asked, tilting his head like he was genuinely curious. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was racing, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. But how? He had a knife, and I was trapped in this creepy basement with no one else around. My parents didn't even know where I was. I hadn't told them I was going to Daniel's house. They just assumed I was hanging out with someone normal. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep calm. I just remembered I have to be home soon," I said, trying to sound casual. "My mom's gonna freak if I'm late." Daniel's face stayed blank for a second, then he smiled again. This time, it was wider, more unsettling. He twirled the knife in his hand and stepped aside, letting me pass. "Sure," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Wouldn't want you to get in trouble." I didn't waste any time. As soon as I was past him, I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I could hear him laughing behind me, this low, creepy chuckle that echoed in the dark basement. When I reached the front door, I yanked it open and sprinted down the street without looking back. I didn't stop running until I was halfway home. My legs felt like jelly, and my chest was burning, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from Daniel as possible. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying everything that had happened in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Daniel really was just messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The look in his eyes when he held that knife, it wasn't a joke. He wasn't playing around. The next day at school, Daniel wasn't there. I kept looking for him, half expecting him to show up at lunch with that same creepy smile, but he never did. In fact, I never saw him again. He just disappeared, like he'd never existed. I never told anyone about what happened. Not my parents, not the school, not even the few kids I eventually made friends with. It seemed easier to just forget about it, but I never really did. Every now and then, I'll think about Daniel. Wonder what happened to him, where he went if he ever pulled that same stunt on someone else, and if they got away. It's been years since all this went down, but I still get chills when I think about it. I've always been the kind of person who likes to take risks. Nothing too crazy, but you know, the thrill of trying something different. My name's Kayla, I'm 19, and I just moved to a new city for college. It's my first time living alone, and to be honest, it's been amazing. Until this happened. It started because I needed a desk. I had been using an old coffee table as my study spot, but my back was killing me. As a broke college student, there was no way I was buying anything brand new. So, I did what any other cheap person would do. I checked Craigslist. I spent hours scrolling through posts, filtering for something in my budget and not too far from my apartment. Eventually, I found the perfect one. A sturdy wooden desk, barely used, and only $30. The ad said, "Must pick up tonight." It felt like a steal, so I immediately emailed the seller. He responded within minutes. The guy's name was Evan, and he seemed normal enough at first. He mentioned he was moving and needed to get rid of some furniture fast. I asked for the address, and he sent it over. It was only about 15 minutes away from my apartment, so I figured, why not? But here's where things got weird. He added, "Come alone. I don't like too many people in my house." Okay, that should have been a red flag, right? But I brushed it off. Maybe he was just a private guy, or maybe his house was messy. Either way, I wanted the desk. I showed up around 8 p.m., just as the sun was setting. His house was in a quiet, older neighborhood where the streetlights flickered just a little too much. I parked my car in the driveway and texted him, "Hey, I'm here." He replied, "Door's open. Come in?" I froze for a second. I mean, who just leaves their door open for strangers? But instead of driving away like a normal person, I convinced myself it was fine. I needed that desk. When I stepped inside, the place was dark. The only light came from a dim lamp in the living room. The air smelled damp, like old wood and something else. Something metallic, maybe. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. That's when I noticed something strange. The walls in the living room were covered in old newspaper clippings, but not normal ones. They were all about missing people. Headlines like, "Teen vanishes without a trace," and "College student disappears after night out." My stomach dropped. What kind of person decorates their house like this? I called out again, louder this time. "Evan? I'm here for the desk." Finally, I heard footsteps coming from the back of the house. They were slow and heavy, like whoever was walking didn't care if I heard them. A tall guy stepped into the light. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with messy brown hair and this weird smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're Kayla, right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaking a little. "Is the desk still available?" He nodded and motioned for me to follow him. Against my better judgment, I did. He led me down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room. The desk was there, all right, but something felt off. The room was completely empty, except for the desk, chair, and a large, heavy-looking padlock on the door from the inside. "Go ahead and take a look," he said. I stepped into the room, trying not to freak out. The desk was exactly like the pictures, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed something on the floor. A single, worn-out sneaker. It was small, like it belonged to a kid or maybe a teenager. My heart started pounding. "Is someone else here?" I asked, turning to face him. His smile widened, and he took a step closer to me. "Why do you ask?" At that moment, I didn't care about the desk anymore. I needed to get out of there. I mumbled something about forgetting my wallet in the car and bolted for the front door. As I reached for the handle, I realized it wasn't moving. It was locked. "Leaving so soon?" Evan's voice came from behind me. I spun around and he was just standing there holding a set of keys. His face was completely blank now, like all the fake friendliness had melted away. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, but before I could call 911, he lunged at me. I screamed and dodged him, running down the hallway toward what I hoped was a back door. My adrenaline was the only thing keeping me moving. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. Then, by some miracle, I found a sliding glass door in the kitchen. I yanked it open and ran as fast as I could into the backyard. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out of there, not even caring about the noise my tires made on the driveway. When I got home, I reported the incident to the police. They went to the house the next day, but Evan was gone. The place was completely cleared out, like he'd never been there. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. A few days later, I was scrolling through the news when I saw a story about a missing girl. She looked familiar, too familiar. And then, it hit me. Her picture was on one of the newspaper clippings in Evan's house. I don't know who Evan really was or how many people he's hurt, but I do know one thing. I'll never, ever use Craigslist again. This memory still crawls under my skin, even though I was only 9 years old when it happened. My parents were hosting a Halloween party that year, so they decided it'd be easier for my cousin Liam and me to go trick-or-treating on our own. They figured we'd just stick to the houses on our street, and my dad gave us an old watch to make sure we'd be back by 9 p.m. at the latest. Liam and I were thrilled at the idea of being on our own. Our small neighborhood was close-knit and mostly safe, or so everyone thought, and since Halloween was on a Saturday that year, most parents were out with their kids. We set out just as the sky grew dark, pillowcases in hand, determined to collect as much candy as possible before we had to return. After hitting most of the houses on our street, we decided to head toward the cul-de-sac at the far end of the neighborhood, a spot most people avoided because the old Maddox house was there. The Maddox house was one of those places that gave everyone chills. It was a hulking, decaying Victorian mansion that sat alone, set back from the road by a long, winding driveway. No one had lived there for years, and it was practically part of every neighborhood ghost story. Liam dared me to go there and to knock on the door, but I knew better. "No way," I said, shoving him. "Even if I wanted to, the place is boarded up. No one lives there." Just as we were about to turn back, we noticed a faint light flickering in the window of the house, like someone was inside. We froze, staring in disbelief, and then exchanged a look that said it all. This was way too tempting to ignore. Against my better judgment, we ventured closer to the house. The porch creaked under our feet, and the air smelled musty, like old books mixed with mildew. When we reached the door, I raised my fist, hesitated, and then knocked. The sound echoed through the house, and we waited, half expecting something, or someone, to respond. But there was nothing. Just as we were about to turn and leave, the door slowly creaked open. Inside, the hallway was dark, but we could make out the shape of a tall, old mannequin standing near the staircase. It was dressed in a vintage suit with a creepy, painted smile that had mostly faded over time. The flickering light we'd seen was coming from a dim candle set near the foot of the stairs. "Do you think someone set this up as a Halloween decoration?" Liam whispered, eyes wide. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a murmur. My curiosity was mixed with a deep, unsettling feeling, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Liam, braver than me, took a few steps inside. I followed close behind, every instinct in my body screaming that this was a bad idea. But then, out of nowhere, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging us into silence. We jumped, and I nearly dropped my pillowcase. We stood there, frozen in the dim light, and that's when we both noticed it. The mannequin had moved. It was now facing us, one hand raised slightly, as if it was waving. Liam grabbed my arm, and I could feel him trembling. "Let's go," he whispered urgently. But before we could reach the door, we heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from somewhere upstairs. My stomach twisted, and I could barely breathe as the footsteps drew closer, thumping down the stairs one agonizing step at a time. Just then, the mannequin's head tilted to the side, its blank eyes somehow fixing on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed up, pulling Liam with me, but he tripped over something on the floor. A small pile of candy wrappers, some of them crumpled and torn, as if they'd been there for ages. The footsteps had stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the room. That's when a voice, soft and cold, whispered from somewhere in the shadows, "Trick or treat." We bolted for the door, yanking it open and bursting out onto the porch, our pillowcases abandoned. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main street, where we finally dared to look back. The Maddox house stood dark and silent, the porch light out, and the door firmly shut, like nothing had happened. To this day, I don't know if it was just some twisted Halloween prank or something far worse. But I do know that after that night, no one ever dared go near the Maddox house again. I never thought that something like this could happen to me. I mean, you hear about it, read about it in the news, but it's always someone else's story, not yours. But I guess that's how it always starts, doesn't it? With the assumption that you're safe, that the horrors of the world are far away. You never realize it until they're right there, staring at you from behind a screen. It all started innocently enough. I was just another girl on Instagram, sharing parts of my life with the world. I'd post photos of myself hanging out with friends, going to cafes, or just lounging around at home. People loved it. The likes rolled in, the comments too. It was fun. Validation, I guess. Harmless, right? Then, he showed up. At first, it was subtle. One comment on a selfie I posted, something generic like beautiful with a heart emoji. Nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't pay much attention. It's Instagram. People compliment each other all the time, but soon, his comments were on every photo. At first, it was just compliments. "You look stunning. Such a cute smile. Perfect as always." But then they got weird. Like really weird. He started calling me by my name, even though my username didn't include it. "Emma, you look amazing today." It felt off, but I shrugged it off. Maybe he knew me from school, or maybe he was just some random creep online. I didn't think too much about it. But then, the comments got personal. Too personal. "You looked so cute in that pink hoodie at the cafe yesterday." "Your blue dress looked perfect in the park today." I never posted anything from those places. He had to be seeing me in person. The comments kept coming, and I began feeling a constant gnawing unease. I'd walk to the corner store and I'd feel eyes on me. Sitting in my favorite coffee shop, I'd glance around, half expecting to see someone staring. I convinced myself it was paranoia. Just a troll being weird online, right? But then, I started noticing the same person. A man, always lingering, always nearby. One night, I was walking home after grabbing a late-night snack. It was dark, and the streets were quiet. I had my headphones in, half listening to music when I felt it. That creeping sensation, like I was being followed. I turned around, and there he was. Not more than 50 feet behind me. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear anything else. I walked faster, trying to shake him off. But every time I glanced back, he was still there, closer this time. I ran the last few blocks to my apartment, fumbling with my keys, slamming the door behind me. I remember standing there, chest heaving, as I stared out the peephole. He walked by my building slowly, head tilted, like he knew I was watching him. That night, I locked every door and window. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like it was him, waiting. The next day, I made my Instagram private. I thought that would be enough. Thought that would make it all stop. But the comments didn't stop. How could they? He had already seen too much. Every time I went outside, I felt him. Watching, waiting, lurking. Then one evening, everything changed. I had just gotten home from class. It was late, and I was exhausted. As I unlocked my door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of my apartment didn't comfort me the way it usually did. Something was off. The air felt wrong, heavy. I froze in the entryway, that creeping feeling crawling up my spine again. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling from the other room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. I knew no one was supposed to be there. No one but me. Silence. I told myself I was being paranoid again, that maybe it was just the wind or the old pipes in the walls. But as I moved towards the hallway, I saw it. A shadow, moving through the dim light of my bedroom. Before I could react, he was on me. A rough hand clamped over my mouth, dragging me backwards. I fought, but he was stronger. He threw me to the ground, and I could feel the cold sting of a blade pressed against my neck. "Shh, Emma," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "I've been waiting for this." I panicked, heart racing, but instinct kicked in. I grabbed at anything within reach, a book, and swung wildly. He grunted in pain, loosening his grip for just a second. That second was all I needed. I shoved him off me with every ounce of strength I had, bolting for the door. My vision blurred with panic, but I didn't stop. I ran out of my apartment, down the hall, and into the street, barefoot and trembling. The street was dark, empty. I didn't know where to go. My apartment building was mostly empty. No one I knew lived nearby. But I saw lights on in one of the houses across the street. An old couple, I think. I sprinted to their door, banging like my life depended on it, because it did. "Please, help! He's trying to kill me!" I screamed, my voice breaking. The door flew open, and the couple looked horrified. They didn't ask questions, just pulled me inside and called the police. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak, but I managed to tell them what had happened. That I knew this man had been following me, that he'd broken into my apartment. By the time the police arrived, I had calmed down enough to explain everything. They went to check my apartment, but he was already gone. There was no sign of him, no forced entry, no clues, just a lingering nightmare that refused to leave. For days after, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice in my ear. Police assured me they'd do everything they could to find him, but the truth is, I don't think they ever will. People like him, they disappear. They blend into the background, waiting, watching. I don't use Instagram anymore. I don't share my life online. My profile is gone, and so is any trace of the person I used to be before all this. Once a stranger finds your profile and decides you're easy prey, everything changes. To them, you're no longer just a person. You're a target. They'll study your every post, every detail you share, and it won't take long for them to know exactly where you are, who you're with, and what you're doing. So if you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Be careful. Be cautious. The internet isn't as safe as it seems. Keep your profile private. Keep your life private. Because once someone finds a way in, you may never get them out. And sometimes, they don't leave without a scar. It was supposed to be a regular school day, but that afternoon is burned into my memory like a bad dream. I'd been out in the hallway, having slipped out of chemistry to grab something from my locker. Our teacher didn't care as long as we were quiet about it, and I needed my book for a test later. But just as I reached the end of the hall, the PA system crackled. I froze, waiting to hear the usual announcements, but instead, the principal's voice came through, tight and trembling. "Attention all students and staff. This is not a drill. We are entering lockdown. I repeat, this is not a drill. Lockdown effective immediately." For a second, I was too stunned to move. I'd been through a dozen drills, but somehow, hearing that it wasn't practice made the walls feel like they were closing in on me. I looked around, hoping I'd see another student or a teacher, anyone. But the hallway was empty, and all the classroom doors were already shut. I panicked, knowing I couldn't go back to class without alerting everyone that I was out here. I glanced down the hall and spotted the library doors about 20 feet away. They were usually left open, so I bolted toward them, hoping that the librarian hadn't locked them already. I got lucky. The doors were still open, so I slipped in quietly and closed them behind me, turning the lock with shaking hands. I glanced around, but the library was empty. It must have been the librarian's break. I knew I needed to hide, but I didn't want to be trapped at the front door. So, I darted down an aisle in the middle of the library, crouching down between two tall shelves of books. I pulled my knees to my chest and tried to control my breathing, listening to the silence. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. I'd barely caught my breath when I heard a noise in the hallway, a faint shuffling sound. My heart skipped. Someone was out there walking slowly, the footsteps deliberate, almost stalking. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the walls, and I realized with horror that they were headed toward the library. I didn't know who it was, but something in me knew that I needed to stay hidden. I crept to the edge of the shelf and peered through the gap between the books, watching the door. The footsteps stopped, and then, with a soft click, I heard the library door unlock. Someone stepped inside. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible. The person didn't move right away. They just stood there, like they were listening. I could see only a shadow cast on the floor from where I was hiding, but it was enough to know they weren't a teacher or student. The figure was too tall, too bulky, and they were moving too slowly, carefully, as if they didn't want to be heard. They started walking, their footsteps softer now, moving through the aisles one by one. I felt trapped, knowing that if I ran, I'd be seen instantly. All I could do was stay hidden and hope that he didn't find me. The man started muttering to himself, his voice low and angry, like he was having an argument with someone who wasn't there. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but every once in a while, I'd catch a word. Something about not getting away and where are you? My stomach dropped and I pressed my back harder against the shelf, willing myself to disappear. I heard him turn down the aisle just across from mine. He was close now, close enough that I could hear his breathing, slow and heavy. Then he stopped again, and I thought maybe he'd leave. But then I heard the distinct sound of books shifting on the shelf next to mine, as if he was moving them, looking for something, or someone. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. If I waited any longer, he'd be on my aisle next. I glanced around and spotted a table at the far end of the library, with enough space underneath to hide. I'd have to move quickly and quietly if I wanted to make it. Taking a deep breath, I pushed off the shelf and crawled along the floor, staying low and trying not to make a sound. I made it to the next shelf, inching my way forward until I was only a few feet from the table. But just as I was about to slip under it, I heard the man's footsteps again. This time, right behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tense as he passed by, barely a few feet away. I could see his shadow cast across the floor, and I forced myself to stay still, praying he wouldn't turn around. After a moment, he kept walking, moving toward the back of the library. I didn't wait to see if he'd double back. I scrambled under the table, pressing myself into the corner and pulling my hoodie over my head, trying to make myself invisible. He moved to the back of the library, his voice growing quieter, but I could still hear him muttering, talking to himself in that strange, angry tone. Just then, the intercom crackled again, and the principal's voice came on, shakier this time. "Students and staff, please remain in lockdown. Law enforcement has entered the building. Please stay in place." The man must have heard it too because he froze, his breathing quickening. I could see his shadow shifting as he looked around, probably realizing his time was running out. Without warning, he let out a frustrated growl and kicked one of the chairs, sending it skidding across the floor. I flinched, but I stayed as still as possible, hoping he wouldn't notice me. Then, I heard him stomp back toward the library door. He pulled it open and left, his footsteps fading into the hallway. I waited, counting the seconds, until I was sure he was gone. I stayed hidden, listening to the silence, until finally, the library door creaked open again. This time, I heard familiar voices. Our school security officers and a couple of teachers would come to check each room. When I crawled out from under the table, I was shaking, and my teacher's eyes widened when he saw me. "They got him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They found him in the East Wing, trying to break into the maintenance room." As they led me back to class, the fear started to wear off. But my mind kept going back to those footsteps in the library, the shadow on the floor, and that low, angry muttering. I still don't know what he was looking for that day, but every time I pass the library, I can't help but glance inside, just to make sure no one's hiding in the shadows. It started with just a couple of Instagram notifications, nothing out of the ordinary at first. You know how it is. Post a photo, get a few likes, maybe a couple of comments. I didn't think much of it when someone named LucyB07 started liking my posts. At first it was pretty flattering, honestly. I'm not some huge influencer or anything, just a regular guy with around 500 followers. But this Lucy was different. She didn't just like my recent photos, she went back. Like, way back. You ever get that feeling where something just doesn't feel right, but you can't put your finger on it? That's what happened. I posted a photo of me at the gym one day, and almost immediately, I got a comment from her. "Looking good?" Okay, sure, I get that kind of comment sometimes. No big deal. But then it kept happening. Every single post. She commented on every picture I put up, even random ones like my food or a landscape shot from some boring road trip. And her comments were weird. Not just flirty or playful, but kind of off. "Can't wait to see you again." Remember me? The thing is, I had no idea who she was. Her profile was private. No picture, just some generic bio with a few emojis. The follower count was low, like under 100, and she had no posts at all. Just a blank profile. So, naturally, I ignored it. Blocked her even. I thought that would be the end of it. I figured it was just some catfish or spam account. But it didn't stop. A couple of days later, she was back. Different username, same comments. I blocked that one too. And then another one popped up. Then another. Always the same message, word for word. "Can't wait to see you again." It was like she was taunting me. But what really freaked me out? The photos she started sending me. I woke up one morning, and there it was. A DM request from another account with no posts, no followers. I shouldn't have opened it, but I was curious. The message was just a picture of me, walking out of my local grocery store. I was in the same clothes I'd worn the day before. My stomach dropped. She had to be close, like really close. I looked at the timestamp. It was from yesterday afternoon. I immediately checked my windows, locked my doors, and made sure no one was around. It was like she was watching me, but I didn't know from where. I wanted to brush it off. Maybe it was just some prank, right? Maybe someone was messing with me. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Nobody knew I blocked that first account. Nobody knew I was getting these pictures. I didn't tell anyone. The next few days were unsettling, to say the least. I started noticing small things, shadows that moved a little too quickly, footsteps behind me that seemed to stop when I turned around. I even heard my phone buzz a couple of times, but there was no notification when I checked. Nothing. Just silence, like she was playing games with me. Then, 2 nights ago, things escalated. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the paranoia that had been creeping in all day. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, you know? I mean, who the hell actually gets stalked like this in real life? But then I heard it, this soft scraping sound, like something sliding across wood. It was coming from downstairs. I froze. My apartment isn't big, just a small, 1-bedroom place. Not much room for anyone to hide. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, an old baseball bat I kept next to my desk. Slowly, I made my way down the hall, listening for the sound again. Nothing. I flicked on the living room lights. Empty. Checked the kitchen. Empty. Even opened up the small closet by the front door. And that's when I heard it again. From my bedroom. I swear to God, it felt like my heart stopped. I had just been in there. There was nothing in that room when I left. I walked back to my room, bat in hand, ready to swing at anything that moved. The door was still open, and everything looked the same. But the closet door? It was slightly open, just a crack. That's when I saw it, her eyes. She was in there, crouched in the dark, just staring at me through the gap. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare back, my breath caught in my throat. She wasn't blinking, wasn't even breathing as far as I could tell. Just watching me. The closet creaked as she slowly pushed the door open, and I could finally see her. It was her, the girl from Instagram. Or at least that's what I thought at first. But up close, she looked different, wrong. Her face was gaunt, eyes wide and bloodshot. She was wearing this dirty, oversized hoodie, and her hair was greasy, sticking to her forehead, like she hadn't showered in days, maybe weeks. I stumbled backward, dropping the bat, and finally managed to shout, "What the hell are you doing in my house?" She didn't answer. Just stepped out of the closet, this slow, deliberate movement like she had all the time in the world. Her hands were shaking, and she kept mumbling something under her breath. It sounded like my name. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the cops. But she lunged at me before I could even unlock it. Her grip was strong, way stronger than I expected. She had me pinned down, her face inches from mine, whispering the same thing over and over. "I knew you'd remember me." I finally shoved her off and bolted out of the room, locking myself in the bathroom. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely dial 911. When the cops arrived, they found her still in my room, just sitting on the edge of my bed like she belonged there. They charged her with trespassing. But what freaked me out the most? When they searched her, they found something tucked into the pocket of her hoodie. It was a photo of me, taken years ago, from my high school yearbook. The girl? Her name wasn't Lucy. She wasn't some random Instagram stalker. She was a girl from my old high school, a girl I had never spoken to, never even noticed. But she had noticed me. For years. I have not seen her since, but that night will haunt me forever. Since then, I moved to a different city, just because I was scared she might come again and try to break into my house, or even worse. There's a reason I still avoid Westfield Park every Halloween. This memory goes back to when I was 12, and every kid in the neighborhood swore that Westfield Park was haunted. It was an overgrown, desolate stretch of land behind an old cemetery, filled with twisted trees and rusted playground equipment. But what made it truly terrifying was the urban legend about a ghostly figure that supposedly roamed the park every Halloween night, looking for lost kids to lead into the woods. Of course, my friends and I were intrigued. That Halloween, my best friend Derek and I planned to hit all the big houses along Hawthorne Drive for trick-or-treating, but our other friend, Jake, had a different idea. He dared us to take the shortcut through Westfield Park on our way home. Derek laughed it off, but Jake was relentless, egging us on, taunting us, until we both gave in. It was nearly 8 p.m. when we reached the park's rusty, half-broken gate. The only light came from a dim street lamp at the edge of the sidewalk, and the moon barely visible behind thick clouds. Westfield Park looked even more intimidating at night, with shadows stretching over the cracked asphalt and gnarled branches twisting overhead. "You guys scared?" Jake whispered with a smirk, though his own voice was wavering. "No way," I shot back, though my stomach was tied in knots. The three of us crept through the gate, and it let out a loud metallic screech that made us all jump. We laughed nervously, each of us trying to hide our fear, but the silence that followed was unnerving. No kids, no parents, not even a single car passed by. It was just us, and the dark, empty park. About halfway through, we noticed something odd near the edge of the playground. A pile of old, tattered Halloween decorations. There were torn masks, broken plastic jack-o'-lanterns, and a few ancient-looking candy wrappers scattered in the dirt. The sight of them sent a chill up my spine, but Jake shrugged it off. "Probably someone's idea of a Halloween prank," he muttered, though I could see his eyes darting around the empty park. We were just about to head out when I heard a soft, rhythmic sound, a shuffling noise, like someone dragging their feet through fallen leaves. I stopped, my heart pounding as Derek and Jake came to a halt beside me. Slowly, we turned toward the sound, and that's when we saw it. A shadowy figure standing near the swings, just a few yards away. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in an old, tattered costume that looked like it was from another era. I couldn't make out a face, but I felt the weight of its gaze. It tilted its head slightly, and I swear it whispered, "Are you lost?" We were frozen, staring at this strange, looming figure. Jake tried to break the tension with a nervous laugh. "Nice try," he called out, his voice barely steady. "Is this some kind of prank?" The figure didn't move or answer, just kept watching us with that eerie tilt of the head. I wanted to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. Then, in one swift, jerking movement, it lifted a bony arm and pointed toward the edge of the park, where a narrow, overgrown trail led into the woods. "Come this way." The voice was faint, like wind whispering through dry leaves. "Let's go," I whispered, tugging on Derek's sleeve. He nodded, his face pale, and even Jake didn't argue. We turned and bolted, running as fast as we could out of that park and back toward the street. I could hear heavy, echoing footsteps behind us, as if the figure was following us, but I didn't dare look back. We just kept running until we reached the sidewalk under the safety of the streetlights. Panting and shaking, we turned back to see the park entrance from a distance. The gate was closed, the swings were empty, and the figure was nowhere in sight. We didn't speak the entire way home, and none of us dared take the shortcut again. But every Halloween, I swear I can still hear that voice echoing faintly in the wind. I never thought about it much before, but it's strange how certain memories stick with you. The ones you don't want to remember. The ones you tell yourself don't matter. They're the ones that linger the longest, like shadows you can't shake. It's been years since high school, but there's one memory that claws its way back into my mind more often than I'd like to admit. Maybe it's guilt, or maybe it's something darker, something I try to pretend doesn't exist. But lately, I can't help but think that some things, some people, you can't escape forever. I wasn't a bad kid, you know? Not really. I mean, none of us were. We were just, dumb. Teenagers. There was a group of us. Me, Darren, Josh, and Ryan. We weren't popular, not by a long shot, but we weren't outcasts either. We were just the regular guys who drifted around the edges, doing our thing, not making much of a mark. But there was this one kid. We called him Mouse. His real name was Ian, but we barely ever used it. Mouse suited him better. He was this small, quiet guy who never seemed to fight back. Easy target. I guess that's where it all started. Harmless teasing, or at least it felt harmless at the time. Looking back, it doesn't seem so harmless anymore. We never really did anything extreme, or at least that's what I kept telling myself for years. No beatings, no serious pranks, just stupid kid stuff. Name-calling, shoving him in the hallway sometimes, or making him the butt of a joke. Darren, the loudmouth of the group, would lead most of it. And we'd all laugh along because it was easier than standing up for Ian. Besides, Ian never stood up for himself, so we figured it didn't bother him. At least, that's what I thought. Now, thinking back on it, I realize how wrong we were. It's like we'd created this narrative in our heads that made it all okay. Ian never said a word, never fought back, so he must have been fine, right? But there were signs. I just didn't see them, or maybe I didn't want to. One night, a few weeks after graduation, I got a text from Darren. It was normal enough. "Hey, meet me at the park, the one by the old playground. Got something to show you. Nothing weird about it." We hung out at that park all the time, especially after dark when it was quiet and no one was around to bother us. So I didn't think twice about it. I grabbed my jacket, threw on my sneakers, and headed out. When I got to the park, it was different. The whole place felt wrong, like something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air was thick, and not in the humid way, but like something heavy was pressing down on everything. The playground, which was usually a place we joked around in, stood empty and silent. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, and I remember thinking it was strange that Darren wasn't there yet. He was always the first to show up. I checked my phone again, thinking maybe I'd misread the message or gotten the time wrong. Nope, it was clear. Be there at 9. It was already a little past that. I waited another 10 minutes, pacing around, feeling more and more uneasy. Something about the way the swings creaked in the breeze made my skin crawl. But I stayed, telling myself it was just my imagination. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting to see Darren walking up, grinning like an idiot for making me wait. But it wasn't Darren. It was Ian. I hadn't seen him in years, not since high school. He looked different, but not in the way I expected. He was taller, sure, and not as scrawny as he used to be, but there was something else, something unsettling about him. His eyes, those same dark, quiet eyes, looked colder, emptier. His face was pale, his expression flat, like he was barely holding something back. And he wasn't smiling. He just stood there for a moment, staring at me, and that's when I noticed he had a phone in his hand. Darren's phone. The one he'd used to text me. I felt this wave of cold realization wash over me. Ian didn't say anything at first, and I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, frozen, waiting for him to make the first move. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was so calm, so eerily calm, it made my stomach churn. "You remember me, don't you?" Of course I did, but for a second I didn't know what to say. I could feel my throat tighten, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. "Ian, what are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at me, his expression unreadable. Then he took a step closer. "You and your friends." You ruined my life." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to deny it, to tell him we didn't mean anything by it, that it was just kids being kids. But the look on his face told me he wouldn't believe that. And honestly, at that moment, I didn't believe it either. "We never meant to..." I started, but he cut me off. "You think I don't know that?" His voice was still calm, almost emotionless, but there was something under the surface, something boiling just beneath the surface of that calmness. "You think I don't know that you thought it was just a joke? Harmless fun?" He took another step forward, and I instinctively took a step back. But it wasn't a joke to me. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. "Ian, man, look, I'm sorry. We were kids. We didn't know what we were doing." His eyes narrowed slightly and I could see his jaw clench. "Do you know what it feels like to be invisible? To be nothing?" He shook his head, his voice still disturbingly calm. "Every day I went home feeling like nothing, like I didn't exist. And that was because of you." I opened my mouth to say something, anything to diffuse the situation. But before I could, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something shiny. At first, I didn't register what it was, but then the light from the lamppost glinted off the blade, and I realized he was holding a knife. My heart stopped. "Ian, what the hell are you doing?" He took another step toward me, his expression still eerily calm. "You took everything from me. Now I'm going to take something from you." I didn't wait for him to explain what he meant. Instinct took over, and I bolted. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just heard the sound of his footsteps behind me, faster and faster, and I knew he was chasing me. The park was a maze of trees and paths, and in the darkness, everything looked the same. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how this had happened, how Ian had gone from that quiet, awkward kid to whatever this was. I could still hear him behind me, his footsteps getting closer. My chest tightened with fear, and I pushed myself harder, forcing my legs to move even though they felt like they were about to give out. I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to process anything except the pure, primal instinct to survive. Suddenly, I tripped over something. A rock or a root, I don't even know. And I hit the ground hard. Pain shot up my leg, and for a moment I thought I might have broken something. But there was no time to check. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and glanced behind me. Ian was gone. I looked around frantically, trying to figure out where he went, but the park was empty. Eerily still. The only sound was the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't know if he'd given up, or if he was just waiting for me to make a mistake. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I limped out of the park as fast as I could, my heart still racing. I made it home, locked every door and window, and sat there in the dark, waiting, listening for any sign that he might have followed me. He never came. Even though this happened a few years ago, and I've never been able to forget it. I never saw Ian again after that night. Darren and the others never heard from him either. It was like he just disappeared. But sometimes, late at night, I think about him, about what happened in that park, and I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder if one day he'll come back to finish what he started. I was 19 when it happened, fresh out of high school and desperate for work. My family wasn't exactly swimming in money, and college wasn't in the cards. So, when I came across an ad on Craigslist for a delivery job offering $300 a night, felt like a godsend. The ad was simple. No experience needed, cash paid up front, just a few late-night deliveries. All I had to do was meet the guy at a gas station about 20 minutes outside of town to pick up the goods, Now I wasn't stupid. I knew Craigslist could be shady, but I figured it was probably some under-the-table stuff. Maybe liquor runs for house parties or something like that. The money was too good to pass up. The first night went smoothly enough. The guy I met, Tom, was older, maybe in his late 40s. He looked like he'd seen better days. Messy hair, hollow cheeks, and that kind of jittery energy you see in people who don't sleep much. He handed me a nondescript box and gave me an address, written on a sticky note. "Don't look in the box," he said. That was it. No small talk, no jokes, just a cold, flat tone that made my skin crawl. I nodded, took the box, and followed the GPS to a run-down apartment building on the edge of town. The guy who opened the door barely even looked at me. He just took the box, handed me an envelope stuffed with cash, and slammed the door. Easy money, right? The second night things got weirder. Tom was waiting for me at the gas station again, but this time, he looked more paranoid. He kept glancing over his shoulder like someone was watching him. He handed me another box, this one heavier than the last. "Same deal," he said. "But if anyone follows you, don't go to the drop-off. Call me." That set off alarm bells. I asked him what was in the box, but he just stared at me with those sunken eyes of his and said, "You don't want to know." The address this time was out in the middle of nowhere, some old farmhouse miles off the main road. By the time I got there, it was pitch black. The driveway was long and unlit, and the house itself looked abandoned. When I knocked on the door, no one answered. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. That's when I heard the sound. Something moving inside, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I turned to leave, but the door creaked open behind me. A man stood there, tall and gaunt, with a blank expression that made my stomach drop. He didn't say a word, just held out his hand for the box. His fingernails were black, like they'd been dipped in ink, and his skin was pale and blotchy, almost gray. I handed him the box and he smiled, a wide, toothy grin that felt entirely wrong. He didn't close the door right away. Instead, he just stood there watching me as I walked back to my car. When I got in, I locked the doors and floored it out of there. By the third night, I was ready to quit. But $300 a night was too much to give up, so I went back. Tom wasn't there when I arrived at the gas station. Instead, there was a different guy waiting. A younger guy, maybe in his 30s, wearing a hoodie and baseball cap. He handed me the box without saying a word. I asked where Tom was, but the guy just shrugged and walked off. This time, the address was even further out, deep into the woods. The road was barely more than a dirt path, and my car's headlights barely cut through the darkness. When I finally reached the location, there was no house, just a clearing with an old, rusted-out trailer in the center. The windows were covered with black trash bags, and the whole place smelled like rotting meat. I didn't want to get out of the car, but I had to finish the job. I grabbed the box and walked up to the trailer. The closer I got, the more the stench made my stomach churn. I knocked on the door, but it swung open on its own. Inside, the walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like red paint, or maybe it wasn't paint. The air was thick and heavy, and I could hear something faint in the background, like whispering, but there was no one there. I set the box down on the floor and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the shadows in the back of the trailer. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I ran back to my car and didn't look back. When I got home, I found a sticky note on my front door. It just said, "Stop asking questions." I never went back. I'll never forget that winter afternoon. It happened nearly 20 years ago, but sometimes it feels like just yesterday. I was a new teacher then, fresh out of college, still figuring out how to manage a room full of restless teenagers. That day, I was supervising my last period English class. The final bell was less than an hour away, and everyone was ready to bolt, Outside, it was snowing heavily, covering everything in a thick, quiet layer of white. That's when the intercom crackled to life. At first, I thought it would be the usual end-of-day announcements, but then I heard Principal Reeves's voice, and he sounded, scared. All teachers and students, this is an emergency lockdown. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Secure your rooms immediately and stay out of sight. I froze, clutching a stack of papers in my hand. I'd only been through lockdown drills once or twice, and they'd always felt surreal, like a scene from a movie. But this time was different. My students looked at me, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. I snapped into action, quickly locking the door and turning off the lights. "Everyone, get down," I whispered, gesturing for them to gather in the corner. I heard a few of them whispering, asking each other what was going on. A couple of kids tried to use their phones, but I told them to turn them off. "No sounds, no lights," I whispered, praying they'd listen. We sat there in silence, the only sound the ticking of the old wall clock. After a few minutes, just as I was beginning to wonder if it was a false alarm, I heard the faint creak of footsteps echoing down the hallway. It was barely audible, but in the silence, it sounded deafening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever was out there wanted us to know they were coming. I felt my heart race. The police were supposed to come in situations like this, right? So why was I hearing footsteps instead of sirens? Then I remembered the news story from earlier that morning. A man had escaped custody from the county jail. They said he was dangerous, a career criminal who'd spent half his life in and out of prison. I dismissed it as just another news headline, but now, huddled in the dark with a room full of students, I felt a cold dread settle over me. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I could feel the students around me holding their breath. Then we heard the faint sound of something dragging along the wall. It was slow, scratchy, as if someone was running their fingernails over the cinder block. I glanced at the door, which suddenly seemed far too thin, too fragile. What if he knew we were in here? What would we do if he tried to get in? I couldn't stop picturing him. A shadowy figure standing right outside, waiting. A loud bang suddenly shattered the silence, followed by a muffled curse. It sounded like he'd kicked one of the lockers in frustration. A couple of students gasped, and I held up my hand, trying to keep them calm. But inside, I was just as terrified as they were. Then, another noise. This time, closer. He was at the door to the classroom next to ours, and we heard the handle rattle, then go silent as he moved further down the hall. I prayed he wouldn't come back our way. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. I thought he'd moved on, that maybe he'd finally left, when suddenly, the footsteps returned, closer than before. I could feel the tension in the room. Every student stiff and silent, like a herd of deer hiding from a wolf. Then came a low voice, so close it seemed like he was right outside our door. "I know you're in there." The voice was rough, like he'd spent years screaming and shouting, or maybe it was just the bitterness in his tone. One of the students let out a whimper, and I could feel them starting to panic. I looked around, whispering for everyone to stay calm, but the tension was too thick. And just as I was starting to worry that one of them would scream, he spoke again, louder this time. "You can't hide forever." I shut my eyes, trying to block out the fear clawing at me. The door handle rattled again, this time violently, and then came a series of loud bangs as he slammed against it, again and again, trying to break in. I thought the door wouldn't hold. It seemed like it was only a matter of time. Then, as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. We all sat there shaking, waiting. The silence stretched on, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stayed crouched down with the students, listening to the heavy, fading footsteps echoing down the hall. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, we heard the faint sound of sirens. And then Principal Reeves came over the intercom again, his voice calmer now. "Attention, all students and staff. The situation has been contained. Please remain in lockdown until further notice." The police arrived, sweeping through the building. They found the man in the basement, hiding among the old sports equipment, as if he'd planned to wait out the search. They dragged him out in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd come to the school for a reason, that he'd been looking for something, or someone. Later I learned he'd been responsible for a string of violent break-ins across the county, his crimes only escalating with each one. They said he had a pattern, something about hunting down his enemies. But to this day, I still wonder why he chose our school, why he seemed so intent on getting into our classroom. And even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. The kids I teach now think lockdowns are just a routine drill, a chance to take a break from class. But every time I lock the door and turn out the lights, I remember that day. And I wonder, if it happens again, will we be so lucky? I'll never forget that Halloween when my friend Jamie and I stumbled into the pumpkin patch on the edge of town. It wasn't one of those big, cheery patches with hay rides and cider stands. No, this one was almost hidden, tucked away on the outskirts, just where the rows of houses faded into open fields. It had a weathered wooden sign that simply read, "Pumpkins for sale," with a faint arrow pointing down a dirt path. Jamie dared me to go, so we pedaled our bikes down the narrow path. The patch was empty, save for a small shack and rows of lumpy, misshapen pumpkins scattered on the ground. There was something eerie about the whole setup, but we shrugged it off, laughing about how much better these pumpkins would look than the perfect, round ones our parents would have picked. We were just about to grab a pumpkin and head out when we heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. From behind the shack, an older man appeared. He had a tall, thin frame, a pale, wrinkled face, and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He wore an old coat that was too long, almost brushing the ground. "Looking for a pumpkin?" he asked in a voice so soft it felt like it barely reached us. His lips stretched into a small, tight smile, but his eyes stayed cold. Yeah," Jamie replied, giving me a sideways glance. "We were just picking one out." The man nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact. "These pumpkins are special, you know," he said, motioning toward the patch. "Picked them myself, in a place far from here. People don't usually come by so late in the season." Jamie and I exchanged a nervous laugh, but something in the man's voice made us feel as though we shouldn't be laughing. "Well, we'll just take this one," I said, picking up a small, lumpy pumpkin near my feet. The man took a step closer, eyeing the pumpkin like he was studying it. Then, with that same odd smile, he reached out his hand. "That one," he whispered, "has character." His fingers brushed the pumpkin's rough surface, lingering for a moment too long. We handed him a few crumpled bills, and he slipped them into his coat pocket without looking. "Be careful, boys," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's more to Halloween night than candy and costumes. Some things can't be seen under the streetlights." "Thanks," Jamie mumbled, pulling me back toward our bikes, but just as we turned, the man spoke again. "You know," he said, "you could always see the place where I picked them. The pumpkins grow better there." He motioned to a small hidden path behind the shack, one that led further out into the fields and into the woods. His smile widened, as though he was waiting for us to follow him. Jamie shook his head, mumbling something under his breath about just wanting a pumpkin. But the man was already moving, stepping into the path with slow, deliberate strides. A low fog had started creeping up from the ground, blanketing the trail in an eerie mist, and the air had grown colder. Jamie and I stood frozen for a second, feeling a strange pressure pulling us forward, as if it'd be easier to follow him than to turn back. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned to us, his face obscured by the shadows. "It's Halloween night, boys," he said, voice now barely audible over the breeze. "A night to remember. You never know what you might find, or what might find you." That was enough for us. Jamie nudged me, and without a word, we turned and ran, the pumpkin thudding against my chest as we dashed toward our bikes. We were nearly there when I glanced back, and my heart nearly stopped. The man was standing at the edge of the path, watching us. But there was something different now. Something wrong. His eyes seemed brighter, almost like they were glowing in the dark, and his smile had vanished. As we jumped on our bikes, I heard him call out in a voice that was nothing like before. Deep, gravelly, like a growl echoing through the trees. "Happy Halloween, boys." We pedaled faster than we ever had, not stopping until we were safely back in my driveway, out of breath and staring at the pumpkin I still clutched in my arms. The pumpkin felt cold, like ice, and something about it sent shivers down my spine. We left it in my backyard that night, too spooked to carve it or even look at it. By morning it was gone, and no one in town seemed to know about the pumpkin patch on the edge of town. To this day, no one remembers any man selling pumpkins there. But every Halloween, Jamie and I avoid that stretch of road, and I still wonder about the old man in the coat and the strange path through the fog, and what would have happened if we'd followed him down that trail. I never really thought something like this could happen to me. I'm pretty careful about the people I interact with online, or at least I used to think I was. But 2 years ago, everything changed. It's still so fresh in my mind that it feels like it happened yesterday. I still get chills when I think about it. It all started on Instagram. I'd post pictures like most people, just random stuff. Me with my friends, my dog, cute outfits, nothing crazy. I'm not one of those influencers or anything, but I had a decent following. Mostly my friends or just normal people from my town. So, when I got a message from this guy, it didn't seem that weird. His profile looked legit. He had a bunch of pictures, normal stuff, him at the gym, some food pics, one with his friends at a concert. Nothing raised any red flags. His message was simple, a compliment on one of my posts. Harmless, right? I didn't think much of it, but I replied. He was cute, normal looking, and honestly, it had been a while since anyone really caught my attention like that. We started chatting, and over the next couple of days, he was perfect. Funny, sweet, said all the right things. He seemed really interested in me. Not just the usual shallow stuff like, "Oh, you're pretty," but he actually asked about my hobbies, my life. He was smart. I felt like I could trust him. About a week in, he suggested we meet. "Dinner, maybe?" he asked. Someplace casual, no pressure. I was nervous, but excited too. I mean, we'd been talking every day for hours, and I felt like I already knew him. So, I agreed. The night of the date, I dressed up a bit. Nothing too fancy, just enough to feel confident. I remember standing in front of the mirror, fixing my hair and thinking, this could be it. He could be someone special. I left my apartment with that weird mix of nerves and excitement, that kind of feeling you get when you think your life's about to change in a good way. But then, things went downhill. Fast. When I got to the restaurant, I didn't see him at first. I looked around, scanning for the guy from the pictures. Instead, this older man, maybe in his late 50s, walked up to me. He wasn't who I was expecting at all. He wasn't even close. I thought he was maybe just someone lost or needing directions or something, but he smiled, like he knew me. "You're Jessica, right?" My stomach dropped. Yeah," I said, confused, glancing behind him to see if maybe the guy I was supposed to meet was nearby. "I'm here to take you to him," the man said casually, as if that made any sense. I froze. "What do you mean? Where is he?" The man didn't flinch. "Oh, don't worry, he's waiting for you. Just come with me." Every instinct I had screamed at me that something was wrong. This didn't feel right. I took a step back. "I think there's been a mistake. I'll just call him—" "No need," the man interrupted, his voice a little firmer. "I'll take you to him." My heart started racing and my hands felt cold and clammy. I wanted to trust that maybe this was just a weird misunderstanding, but something about the way he kept insisting. It made my skin crawl. I shook my head. "No, I'm just gonna go home." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away quickly, not running, but close to it. I heard him call after me, his voice suddenly sounding annoyed. "You're making a mistake." I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, praying that this was all some strange joke, that I'd go home and laugh about it later. But when I reached the end of the block, I glanced over my shoulder. He was following me. My heart leapt into my throat. He was far enough behind that it wasn't obvious, but he was definitely following. I sped up, trying to get to a busier street where there were people around. Maybe he'd lose interest if I was in a crowd. I managed to get home without him catching up, but the whole time, I had this sick feeling in my stomach. When I got inside, I locked the door and double-checked it. Then I did something I've never done before. I checked all the windows, the back door, everything. I even pulled the curtains closed. I tried to shake it off. I told myself he was probably just trying to help, that I'd misread the whole situation. But it didn't help. I barely slept that night. And when I did, I had nightmares. The next day, everything seemed fine. I was still freaked out, but I went to work like normal. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. That was until I got home that night. I walked into my apartment, and immediately, something felt off. It's hard to explain, but you know that feeling when you just know someone's been in your space? The air felt heavy, like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I heard it. A noise. Just a soft shuffle, like something moving in the back of the apartment. I froze. For a second, I thought maybe it was my imagination, maybe the wind or a neighbor. But then it came again, louder this time, like someone was walking inside my apartment. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. Then, without thinking, I ran. I ran into my bedroom and shut the door quietly, locking it behind me. My eyes darted around the room, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I saw my closet. I know it sounds stupid, hiding in a closet like some horror movie cliché, but I didn't know what else to do. I slipped inside and closed the door, crouching down, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart was pounding so loud. In my ears, I was afraid whoever was out there would hear it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps coming down the hall. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, praying the lock would keep them out. But then the door creaked open. He was inside. I could see through the tiny crack in the closet door. The old man. The one from the restaurant. He was in my room. He was looking for me. I had to bite down on my hand to keep from making any noise. He walked around the room slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I saw him glance under the bed, check behind the curtains. Then he moved towards the closet. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold on to the heavy lamp I'd grabbed from the cabinet near the bed in case I had to defend myself. He was getting closer. I saw his hand reach for the closet door. Without thinking, I swung the lamp as hard as I could. It connected with his head, and he let out a low groan before collapsing to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious. I ran. I ran out of my apartment, down the stairs, and onto the street. I didn't stop until I was outside, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The police came. They found him still knocked out on my bedroom floor. Turns out, he had been stalking me for days. He was the guy I'd been talking to online. He'd made a fake profile using someone else's pictures, all so he could lure me in. They arrested him that night, but I haven't been the same since. I made private all my social media accounts, stopped talking to anyone I didn't know personally. And even now, 2 years later, I still get that sick feeling whenever I hear a noise at night. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. I was 22 and broke, like ramen every day broke. I had just moved to this tiny city for college and couldn't afford much for my apartment, so I was scouring Craigslist for cheap furniture. One night, I stumbled across this post. Free couch, good condition, must pick up tonight. It was perfect. The post had one picture, a tan sectional that looked clean enough, and the description was pretty standard. But the weird part? No address, just a phone number. I texted the guy immediately. He responded quickly. You want it? Come to 3237 Westland Drive, back alley. That should have been my first red flag. I mean, who gives away a decent couch and insists you pick it up from an alley? But I was desperate and too naive to care. Plus, it was already 9 p.m. And I figured someone else might grab it if I waited until morning. I borrowed my roommate's truck and headed out. The neighborhood wasn't great. Dimly lit streets, run-down houses, and barely anyone around. When I reached Westland Drive, I slowed down to find the alley. It wasn't easy to spot, but eventually I saw a narrow, shadowy lane between two boarded-up houses. I texted the guy. Here, where's the couch? His reply came almost instantly. Drive down the alley. I'll help you load it. Now, any sane person would have noped out of there. But again, I was broke, and this couch was free. So I turned into the alley. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the walls on either side felt like they were closing in. About halfway down, I saw it. The couch. It was sitting under a flickering streetlight, right in the middle of the alley. No one was around. I stopped the truck and got out. The couch looked the same as in the picture, maybe a little dirtier. It smelled weird too, like damp fabric and something else I couldn't place. I looked around and called out, "Hey, I'm here for the couch." No answer. I texted again. "I see the couch. Where are you?" This time, he didn't reply. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The silence, the smell, the way the couch was just sitting there like it had been waiting for me. But I told myself I was overthinking it. I grabbed one end of the couch and started dragging it toward the truck. As soon as I touched it, I froze. The fabric was damp, not just from the smell, but actually wet and sticky. My stomach churned as I pulled my hand back. My palm was smeared with something dark. Blood. I stumbled back, heart racing. I reached for my phone to call 911, but before I could unlock it, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, but the alley was empty. "Hello?" I shouted, trying to sound confident, but my voice cracked. The footsteps stopped. Then, from behind me, a low voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but no one was there. At that point, I didn't care about the couch or my bank account. I bolted to the truck, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and reversed out of the alley as fast as I could. When I finally got home, I parked the truck and sat there, trying to calm down. My phone buzzed, and I almost dropped it. It was a text from the same number. "Don't come back. Next time, you won't leave." I blocked the number, locked all my doors, and tried to forget about it. But a week later, I saw another Craigslist post. Free chair, great condition. Must pick up tonight. The address? 3237 Westland Drive. I didn't sleep that night. If you enjoyed this story, you might want to check out our other videos and maybe consider subscribing. It really means a lot to the channel and helps us build a real community of horror lovers like you.